My teenage son set his youth pastor's house on fire, and I'm paying for the best lawyer money can buy. The detective called me at 3 a.m. saying my son was in custody for arson, and I needed to come to the station immediately. I'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours after a double shift at the hospital where I worked as an ER physician. My son Ethan was 16 years old and had never been in trouble beyond a speeding ticket last summer. The detective's voice was flat when he said the fire department had found accelerant patterns in security footage showing Ethan pouring gasoline around Pastor Wright's house before lighting it. I asked if anyone was hurt, and the detective said Pastor Wright was in the ICU with second-degree burns and smoke inhalation. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel driving to the police station. Ethan sat in an interrogation room wearing his church youth group hoodie, with ash smeared across his face and his eyes completely dead. I'd never seen my son look like that, like someone had reached inside him and scooped out everything that made him Ethan. The detective, a man named Raymond Kowalski with tired eyes and coffee breath, told me Ethan had confessed to starting the fire. He said my son had waived his right to have me present during questioning and had given a detailed statement about buying the gasoline, waiting until Pastor Wright was home, and setting the blaze. I asked to speak with my son alone, and Raymond said that wasn't happening until Ethan was formally charged. They were processing him for attempted murder and arson, both felonies that could put him in adult prison for 25 years. I asked Ethan through the glass partition why he would do something like this, and he looked at me with those hollow eyes and said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a canyon I couldn't cross. Raymond came back with paperwork about bail hearings and court dates, and I signed everything they put in front of me while my brain tried to process that my son, who cried when we had to put our dog down last year, had tried to burn someone alive. The arraignment was set for Monday morning, and they were holding Ethan in juvenile detention until then. I asked if I could hug him, and Raymond said no physical contact. I pressed my hand against the glass, and Ethan didn't move. I drove home as the sun was rising and sat in my driveway staring at our house, the basketball hoop Ethan had asked for 3 Christmases ago, the garden his mother had planted before she died of cancer 4 years ago. My phone started ringing with numbers I didn't recognize, and I let them all go to voicemail. The first one I listened to was from Pastor Wright's wife demanding to know how I'd raised such a monster. The second was from our church elder saying I needed to find somewhere else to worship. The third was from Ethan's youth group leader, saying she'd always known there was something wrong with him. I deleted them all and called the best. Criminal defense attorney in the state, a woman named Diana Roth, who had a reputation for taking impossible cases and winning them. Her assistant said she'd call me back within 24 hours. Diana called me 6 hours later while I was sitting in my living room trying to understand what had happened. Her voice was sharp and professional when she said she'd already reviewed Ethan's arrest report and the initial evidence. She said the case looked bad, really bad, and I'd be looking at legal fees starting around $150,000 if this went to trial. I told her I'd mortgage the house, drain my retirement, sell everything I owned if it meant keeping my son out of prison. Diana said she'd need to meet with Ethan before deciding whether to take the case, and I gave her permission to visit him in detention. She said she'd go that afternoon and call me after. I spent the next 4 hours reading everything I could find online about arson charges and juvenile offenders being tried as adults. The district attorney had a press conference scheduled for 6 p.m., and I watched it on my laptop. DA Margaret Finley stood behind a podium with Pastor Wright's family beside her, his wife sobbing and his teenage daughter glaring at the camera. Margaret said this was a clear case of premeditated attempted murder by a dangerous young man who needed to be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. She said they'd be seeking to try Ethan as an adult and pushing for the maximum sentence. The comments section filled with people calling my son a psychopath and saying he should rot in prison. Nobody asked why a 16-year-old honor student with no history of violence would suddenly try to kill his youth pastor. Diana called me at 8 p.m., and her voice had changed, the professional edge replaced with something that sounded like anger. She said she'd just spent 2 hours with Ethan and she was taking the case. I asked what Ethan had told her, and Diana said attorney-client privilege prevented her from sharing specifics, but I needed to trust her and stop talking to anyone about the case. She said the police and DA's office would be looking for anything to strengthen their case, and every word I said could be used against Ethan. I asked if my son had explained why he did it, and Diana said yes, but we'd discuss that in person at her office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. She told me not to talk to reporters, not to talk to church members, not to talk to anyone except her. I agreed, and she hung up. That night I couldn't sleep, just lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about Ethan as a little boy, how he'd always been sensitive and kind, how he'd volunteered at the homeless shelter every Saturday, how he'd cried watching videos of animals being rescued. The Ethan I knew would never hurt anyone. Something had broken him badly enough to make him capable of this, and I needed to understand what. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana at 2 a.m. saying she'd filed motions to suppress Ethan's confession and to keep him in juvenile detention instead of transferring him to adult jail. She said the bail hearing was still set for Monday, and I should expect bail to be denied given the severity of the charges. I arrived at Diana's office at 8:45 a.m., and she met me in the lobby instead of making me wait. Her office was on the 15th floor overlooking downtown, with law books lining every wall and file boxes stacked in corners. Diana was in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back tight, and eyes that looked like they could dissect a witness on the stand without mercy. She gestured to a chair and closed the door behind us. "Your son didn't start that fire because he's violent or crazy," she said. "He started it because Pastor Wright has been sexually abusing him for the past 18 months. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I couldn't breathe for several seconds. Diana pulled out a legal pad covered in notes and started reading. Ethan had told her everything in detail, how Pastor Wright had started grooming him after Ethan's mother died, how the abuse began with inappropriate touching during counseling sessions and escalated to assault. Ethan had documented everything in a journal he'd hidden in his school locker, including dates, times, and descriptions of what Wright had done to him. He'd tried to tell 2 different church elders, and both had dismissed him, saying he was confused or seeking attention after his mother's death. He'd tried to tell me 3 months ago, and I hadn't believed him. Had told him Pastor Wright was a good man and Ethan needed to stop making up stories. I remembered that conversation now, Ethan crying in his room and saying he needed to tell me something important about Pastor Wright, and me shutting him down because I was exhausted from a shift and didn't want to hear teenage drama about church politics. Diana said Ethan had finally snapped when he discovered Wright was starting to groom a younger boy in the youth group, a 12-year-old named Leo, whose father had just died. Ethan had confronted Wright, and Wright had laughed, said nobody would ever believe a troubled teen over a respected pastor. That's when Ethan had decided that if the adults wouldn't protect these kids, he'd stop Wright the only way he could think of. Diana had already hired a private investigator to look into Wright's background and had found 2 previous churches where Wright had been youth pastor before ours. Both times he'd left under mysterious circumstances with sealed personnel files. She'd also found a sealed juvenile record from when Wright was 17, involving allegations of inappropriate conduct with a younger child. The pattern was there, if anyone had bothered to look. I asked Diana why Ethan hadn't told her any of this during his police interrogation, and she said because Detective Kowalski had specifically told Ethan that if he claimed abuse, they'd charge him with making false statements in addition to the arson charges. Kowalski had said the DA's office wouldn't believe a word against Pastor Wright, who'd been a pillar of the community for 15 years. So Ethan had confessed to the fire without explaining why, thinking at least that way the abuse would stop, because Wright would be too scared to continue while under scrutiny. I sat in Diana's office trying to process that my son had been raped repeatedly for over a year while I'd been oblivious. Diana said Ethan had been exhibiting classic signs of abuse that I'd missed or attributed to grief over his mother's death. The withdrawal from friends, the declining grades, the nightmares, the sudden reluctance to attend church events he'd previously loved. I'd thought he was depressed about losing his mom and had gotten him a therapist who specialized in grief counseling. The therapist had noted concerning behaviors, but when she'd asked Ethan if anyone was hurting him, he'd said no, because Wright had threatened to destroy our family if Ethan ever told. Wright had said he'd claim I was an unfit father and had been abusing Ethan myself, that church members would testify against me, that I'd lose my medical license, and Ethan would end up in foster care. So Ethan had stayed silent and endured it, trying to protect me while being destroyed from the inside. Diana said we had 2 paths forward. We could take this to trial and expose everything Wright had done, which would mean putting Ethan on the stand to testify in graphic detail about the abuse. The defense would be that Ethan had acted to protect other children when all legitimate authorities had failed. Or we could try to negotiate a plea deal where Ethan pled to lesser charges in exchange for avoiding trial. Diana said she never recommended plea deals in cases like this because Ethan deserved to have his truth heard, but the decision was ultimately mine and Ethan's. I asked what would happen at trial, and Diana laid it out clinically. The prosecution would paint Ethan as a disturbed teen who'd tried to murder someone. They'd bring in psychiatrists to testify about his mental state, would parade character witnesses saying Wright was a good man, would argue that even if abuse had occurred, attempted murder wasn't a reasonable response. The defense would counter with Ethan's journal, with testimony about his repeated attempts to report the abuse, with evidence of Wright's pattern of predatory behavior. We'd bring in expert witnesses about grooming and trauma responses. We'd show that Ethan had exhausted every legitimate avenue for help before resorting to desperate measures. The jury would have to decide whether a 16-year-old abuse victim who'd been failed by every authority figure in his life should go to prison for trying to stop his abuser the only way he thought possible. Diana said she'd won harder cases, but this would be brutal for Ethan. The prosecutor would cross-examine him about every detail of the abuse, would try to trip him up on dates and times, would suggest he was lying or exaggerating. The defense would need to be equally detailed in questioning to establish credibility. Ethan would have to relive his trauma in front of a courtroom full of strangers and cameras because this case would be highly publicized. I asked Ethan what he wanted when Diana arranged for me to visit him in detention that afternoon. He looked smaller than I remembered, sitting in an orange jumpsuit in a concrete room with bars on the windows. His eyes weren't dead anymore, but filled with something worse, a crushing shame that made me want to break something. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you," I said first thing. "I'm so sorry I failed you." Ethan started crying, and I couldn't hug him, could only press my hand against the plastic partition between us. He said he was sorry for burning down Wright's house, Sorry for putting me through this. Sorry for being such a burden after Mom died. I told him none of this was his fault, that the only person to blame was Wright and the system that protected him. I asked if he wanted to go to trial or take a plea, and Ethan said he wanted people to know what Wright had done. He said Leo deserved to be safe, and other kids deserved to know why it happened so they'd understand to speak up if someone hurt them. I told him I'd support whatever he decided, and would spend every penny I had to get him the best defense possible. Diana had already filed motions to get Ethan's journal from his school locker, to get Wright's personnel files from the previous churches, to depose the church elders who'd dismissed Ethan's complaints. The DA's office was fighting everything, claiming the journal was inadmissible hearsay, the personnel files were protected by religious confidentiality, the elders' testimony was irrelevant to the arson charge. Judge Beverly Garrison would be hearing the motions next week, and Diana said Beverly was tough but fair and might actually listen to our arguments. The bail hearing Monday morning was a disaster. The prosecutor, a young attorney named Scott Brennan who looked fresh out of law school, argued that Ethan was a danger to the community and flight risk. He showed photos of Wright's burned house and medical reports about Wright's injuries. Scott said Ethan had planned this attack for weeks, had bought gasoline and waited for the perfect opportunity, and had shown no remorse. Diana countered that Ethan had no prior record, was a minor who lived with his father, and had strong community ties through school and church. She carefully avoided mentioning the abuse because the judge had sealed that part of Ethan's statement pending the evidentiary hearing. Judge Garrison denied bail entirely, citing the severity of the charges and the risk to public safety. Ethan would remain in juvenile detention until trial. I watched them take my son back through the side door and wanted to scream at everyone in that courtroom about what Wright had done, but Diana's hand on my arm stopped me. Not yet, she said quietly. We tell this story the right way, or not at all. The church held a prayer vigil for Pastor Wright that evening, and social media exploded with photos of hundreds of people holding candles and praying for his recovery. The local news ran stories about the beloved pastor who dedicated his life to helping troubled youth, nearly killed by one of the teens he'd tried to save. Wright's wife gave an interview from his hospital bedside saying she forgave Ethan, but hoped justice would be served. Nobody mentioned that Wright was facing zero investigation into why a previously nonviolent teen had targeted him specifically. Diana's investigator, a former detective named Marcus Holt, started digging into Wright's background and found gold within 48 hours. The first previous church had paid a settlement to a family whose son had accused Wright of abuse, with the settlement contingent on an NDA and the family leaving the congregation. The second church had transferred Wright quietly after multiple complaints from parents about his interactions with teenage boys. Neither church had reported Wright to police or had his name added to any registry. The pattern was clear. Wright had been preying on vulnerable boys for at least a decade, while churches protected their reputation by quietly shuffling him around. Marcus found 3 former victims willing to testify if given immunity from their NDAs, which would require getting a judge to void those agreements as illegal attempts to conceal crimes. Diana filed motions immediately, and the DA's office went nuclear, filing counter motions to block any testimony about Wright's past as prejudicial and irrelevant. Scott argued in his filing that even if Wright had abused Ethan, which the state did not concede, that didn't justify attempted murder. A victim's proper recourse was to report to authorities, not commit vigilante violence. Diana's response brief was devastating, documenting Ethan's 2 attempts to report to church elders and my dismissal of his disclosure, proving he'd tried every legitimate avenue before resorting to desperate measures. She argued that Wright's pattern of abuse was directly relevant to establishing Ethan's motive and showing this wasn't random violence, but a targeted response to ongoing victimization. Judge Garrison scheduled a hearing for the following week to address all pending motions. Diana spent every day preparing, interviewing potential witnesses, gathering evidence, building a timeline of Wright's predatory behavior across multiple states. She hired an expert in trauma and child sexual abuse, Dr. Patricia Thornton, who reviewed Ethan's journal and therapy records and wrote a detailed report about grooming patterns and victim responses. Dr. Thornton noted that Ethan's behavior was consistent with severe ongoing abuse, including the delayed disclosure, the initial attempts to report followed by recanting, and the eventual violent outbreak when faced with another child, being endangered. Marcus tracked down Wright's juvenile record and found it had been sealed after Wright turned 18, but the arresting officer was still alive and willing to talk. Officer Dennis Wolfe was retired now, but remembered the case clearly because it had bothered him for 40 years. A 17-year-old Wright had been caught molesting his 10-year-old neighbor, but the family had declined to press charges after pressure from their church. Dennis had written extensive notes documenting Wright's lack of remorse and his statement that the child had wanted it. Those notes had been part of the sealed file that Diana's motion was trying to access. The hearing filled the courtroom with reporters and spectators. Pastor Wright's supporters packed one side, wearing matching yellow ribbons. I sat alone on the other side with Diana beside me, taking notes. Judge Garrison entered, and everyone stood. Then she spent 10 minutes reading through the motions and briefs before looking at both attorneys. Mr. Brennan, you're arguing that the defendant's claims of abuse are both false and irrelevant. You can't have it both ways. Either you want to litigate whether the abuse occurred, which means opening discovery into Mr. Wright's background, or you want to exclude all mention of abuse, which means you can't dispute the defendant's motive. Choose. Scott stammered that the state's position was the abuse allegations were unproven and therefore shouldn't be allowed as evidence. Judge Garrison said that was exactly the question for trial, and she was inclined to allow all relevant evidence about Wright's background and Ethan's attempts to report. Scott tried to argue about prejudice, and she cut him off. Counselor, you're prosecuting a child for attempted murder of an adult in a position of authority. The jury deserves to know the full context of their relationship. I'm granting the defense motion to unseal the prior church settlements and to allow testimony from those victims. I'm also granting the motion to access the juvenile record with redactions for the minor victim's identity. Scott's face went red, and he objected that this would turn the trial into an indictment of Wright rather than Ethan. Judge Garrison said that ship had sailed when the DA decided to charge Ethan as an adult for trying to stop ongoing abuse. If you want to pursue this prosecution, you'll do it with all the evidence on the table, or you can reconsider your charging decision. She set trial for 2 months out and told both sides to prepare for a long fight. Diana smiled for the first time since I'd met her, and Scott looked like he'd been punched. The local media started picking up the story differently after the hearing. One reporter, a woman named Jessica Navarro, who covered criminal justice issues, filed FOIA requests for the church's correspondence about Wright and got back emails showing the leadership had known about concerning behavior for years. Jessica's article ran online that night with the headline, "Did Church Leaders Ignore Warning Signs About Pastor Accused of Abuse?" The comments section exploded with people sharing their own stories of abuse by religious leaders and institutions that covered it up. Wright's supporters started wavering as more information came out. His wife deleted her social media accounts after people flooded her page asking if she'd known about her husband's history. The church issued a statement saying they were cooperating with investigators and taking all allegations seriously, which was a lie because they'd filed motions to block Diana's subpoenas for church records. Diana hired a forensic IT specialist named Kevin Walsh to examine Wright's computers and phones, which the police had seized but hadn't thoroughly analyzed. Kevin found encrypted folders containing thousands of photos and videos of teenage boys in various states of undress. Some were clearly taken at church events, others in Wright's home or car. Kevin found metadata showing the files dated back 15 years and included boys from all 3 churches where Wright had worked. He found messages between Wright and other men trading similar content, forming a network of predators who shared victims and techniques. Kevin turned everything over to Diana, who immediately contacted the FBI because the interstate nature of the material made it federal jurisdiction. The FBI agents who came to Diana's office were from a task force focused on child exploitation, and they treated Wright's files as a major break in a long-running investigation. They'd been tracking the network Wright was part of for 2 years, but hadn't identified most of the participants. Wright's files gave them names, locations, and evidence to pursue dozens of cases. The lead agent, a woman named Catherine Frost, told Diana that Wright was looking at federal charges that would carry more prison time than Ethan's arson ever could. Catherine asked if Ethan would be willing to testify in the federal case, and Diana said maybe, depending on how the state charges resolved. The next day, the FBI raided Wright's hospital room and arrested him on federal child pornography charges. His bail was revoked, and he was transferred to federal custody as soon as doctors cleared him for release. The DA's office called Diana that afternoon and asked to meet about Ethan's case. Scott Brennan showed up at Diana's office with his supervisor, a senior prosecutor named Helen Takagi, who'd been with the DA's office for 20 years. Helen did most of the talking, saying they'd reviewed the new evidence and were prepared to offer a deal. Ethan would plead guilty to reckless endangerment, a misdemeanor, with a sentence of time served plus probation and mandatory counseling. Diana said absolutely not, that Ethan wasn't pleading to anything because he'd been defending himself and other children from a predator. Helen said the state couldn't just drop charges when someone had committed arson and caused serious injuries, that there had to be some accountability. Diana asked where the accountability was for the church elders who'd ignored Ethan's reports, for the system that had allowed Wright to abuse children for 15 years, for the churches that had covered up his history. She said if the DA wanted to hold people accountable, they should start there. Scott jumped in, saying they couldn't prosecute people for not reporting what they didn't believe, and Diana laughed. She pulled out a binder containing copies of emails between church elders discussing Ethan's allegations and debating whether to investigate. The emails showed they'd believed Ethan, but had decided it was better to handle things internally than involve authorities. One elder had written that involving police would damage the church's reputation, and they should give Wright a chance to prove the allegations false. Diana said that was conspiracy to obstruct justice, and she'd be happy to provide this evidence to prosecutors interested in pursuing it. Helen's face went pale, and she said she'd need to discuss this with her supervisors. The meeting ended without a deal, and Diana told me later that she'd basically declared war on the DA's office. They wanted an easy resolution where Ethan takes a plea and everyone moves on. I just showed them we're burning this whole system down if they push us to trial. The DA's office went quiet for 3 days, while Helen and her supervisors decided how to handle the case. During that time, Jessica Navarro published another article about the church's internal communications and public pressure mounted on DA Margaret Finley to drop the charges against Ethan. A petition started online calling for Ethan's immediate release and for charges against the church elders who'd covered up rights abuse. It got 50,000 signatures in 48 hours. Pastor advocacy groups released statements saying the prosecution of abuse victims who'd exhausted all legitimate remedies was unjust. Margaret held a press conference where she looked visibly uncomfortable and said the office was reviewing all evidence and considering all options. She refused to answer questions about whether she'd pursue charges against the church elders. That evening, Marcus called Diana with information that made her go completely still. He'd found a connection between Margaret Finley and the church where Wright had worked. Margaret's husband was on the board of directors for the church's regional council. Marcus had emails showing Margaret's husband had been involved in the decision to transfer Wright from the first church to ours after the initial abuse allegations. Diana filed a motion demanding Margaret recuse herself from the case due to conflict of interest. The motion laid out the connections and argued Margaret couldn't objectively prosecute Ethan when her own family had been part of the system that enabled Wright's abuse. The judge assigned to hear the recusal motion was different from Judge Garrison, an older man named Thomas Whitmore, who had a reputation for being pro-prosecution. Diana wasn't optimistic, but the motion had to be filed regardless. The hearing was contentious, with Margaret personally defending her ability to remain on the case. She said her husband's position was irrelevant, and she'd had no knowledge of Wright's history. Diana presented the emails showing Margaret's husband had been directly involved in discussions about Wright's transfer and that Margaret had attended church functions where Wright was present. Judge Whitmore took the matter under advisement and said he'd rule within a week. In the meantime, Ethan's trial date was approaching, and Diana was preparing for every possibility. She deposed both church elders who'd dismissed Ethan's reports, and they both admitted under oath that they'd believed something inappropriate had happened but had wanted to handle it internally. Their depositions were damning, showing a pattern of institutional protection for Wright at the expense of children's safety. Diana also deposed Wright's wife and discovered she'd found inappropriate texts between Wright and teenage boys on his phone 2 years ago. She'd confronted him, and he'd claimed the boys were troubled and he was trying to help them through difficult times. She'd believed him and never reported the texts to anyone. Diana asked if she'd ever suspected her husband was abusing children, and Mrs. Wright broke down, admitting she'd had concerns but had been afraid to look too closely because the truth would destroy their life. Judge Whitmore ruled on the recusal motion 5 days before trial. He denied it, saying while Margaret's husband's connection was concerning, there was no direct evidence Margaret had knowledge of the situation or had influenced the prosecution. Diana immediately filed an appeal, but the appellate court wouldn't rule before the trial date. We were going forward with Margaret still running the prosecution. Diana spent the weekend before trial in her office preparing witnesses and evidence. She'd lined up the 3 former victims to testify about Wright's pattern of abuse. She had Dr. Thornton ready to explain trauma responses and grooming. She had Officer Dennis Wolfe prepared to testify about Wright's juvenile record. She had Kevin Walsh ready to explain the computer evidence, and she had Ethan ready to tell his story. I spent the weekend with Ethan in detention, talking through what was coming. He was scared but determined. He said he wanted other kids to know they could fight back when adults failed them. I told him I was proud of him for being so brave, and he started crying, saying he didn't feel brave, just broken. Monday morning arrived, and the courtroom filled before 8 a.m. Wright's supporters had dwindled, but a core group remained, including his wife and daughter. They sat on one side wearing yellow ribbons. On the other side sat abuse survivors' advocates, reporters, and me. Diana wore a dark suit and carried 3 file boxes of evidence. Ethan was brought in wearing a dress shirt and slacks I'd brought for him. He looked so young sitting at the defense table. Judge Garrison entered, and we all stood. She looked at the packed courtroom and warned that she'd clear it immediately if anyone disrupted proceedings. Jury selection took all day Monday and most of Wednesday morning. Diana used her challenges to remove anyone with strong church affiliations or who'd expressed bias in the jury questionnaires. Margaret tried to remove anyone who'd signed the online petition supporting Ethan or who'd expressed skepticism of religious institutions. They ended up with a jury of 7 women and 5 men ranging from their 20s to their 60s. Most looked skeptical of both sides, which Diana said was the best we could hope for. Opening statements started Wednesday afternoon. Margaret went first, painting Ethan as a troubled teen who'd become violent after his mother's death. She said the evidence would show Ethan had planned and executed an attempted murder, had confessed to the crime, and had shown no remorse. She said whatever Ethan claimed about his relationship with Wright, attempted murder was never justified. Diana stood for the defense opening and spent 5 minutes in complete silence just looking at the jury. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and conversational. Ethan Carver is 16 years old. He's never been in trouble. He volunteers at a homeless shelter every Saturday. He loves basketball and science fiction books. And for 18 months, he was raped repeatedly by the man everyone in his community trusted, the man who was supposed to guide troubled youth toward God, the youth pastor who told him nobody would believe him if he told. Diana walked the jury through Ethan's attempts to report, showing the journal entries and emails to church elders. She showed photos of text messages between Ethan and his friend, where he'd tried to tell what was happening but had been too ashamed to use specific words. She explained how Ethan had discovered Wright was grooming another child and had panicked. This case is about what happens when a child exhausts every legitimate avenue for help and is failed at every turn. Ethan Carver didn't commit attempted murder. He committed an act of desperate self-defense and defense of another child when every adult in his life had abandoned him. The jury looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. One older woman in the back row had tears in her eyes. Margaret objected that Diana was testifying rather than making an opening statement, and Judge Garrison sustained it, telling Diana to stick to what the evidence would show. Diana apologized and continued, laying out the computer evidence, the prior victims, the pattern of institutional cover-up. By the time she finished, the jury looked at Ethan differently, not as a violent criminal, but as a child who'd been pushed beyond his limits. The first witness Margaret called was the fire chief who'd investigated the scene. He testified about the accelerant patterns, the intensity of the blaze, the damage to Wright's house. Diana's cross-examination focused on one detail. The fire had been set only on the first floor while Wright's bedroom was on the second floor. The chief admitted the burn patterns suggested someone who wanted to trap Wright upstairs, not kill him. If someone wanted Pastor Wright dead, they'd have set the fire on the second floor where he was sleeping, correct? Diana asked. The chief agreed that would be more effective. But this fire was set downstairs, giving him time to wake up and escape through a window, which is what happened. The chief confirmed that Wright had escaped through his bedroom window before firefighters arrived. Diana established that while the fire was serious and dangerous, it had been set in a way that maximized Wright's chance of survival. The next witness was Detective Kowalski, who testified about Ethan's confession. Diana's cross was brutal. Detective, did you ask Ethan why he set the fire? Kowalski said yes, and Ethan had said he wanted to stop Wright. Did you ask what he meant by stopping Wright? Kowalski said he'd assumed Ethan meant he wanted Wright dead. But you didn't ask for clarification? No. And when Ethan tried to explain about abuse, you told him that claiming abuse would result in additional charges, correct? Kowalski said he'd warned Ethan that making false statements could be prosecuted. So a 16-year-old boy who'd just confessed to arson was told by a police detective that if he explained why he did it, he'd face additional criminal charges? Kowalski said he'd been following procedure to avoid giving the defense a fabricated excuse. Diana let that answer hang in the air before saying she had no further questions. The jury looked disgusted. Margaret called Wright's doctor to testify about his injuries. Second-degree burns on his arms and back, smoke inhalation requiring oxygen, trauma from jumping from a second-story window. The doctor said Wright would have permanent scarring and lung damage. Diana didn't cross-examine because the severity of Wright's injuries wasn't in dispute. The prosecution rested Thursday afternoon after just 3 witnesses. Diana immediately moved for dismissal, arguing the state hadn't proven intent to kill as required for attempted murder. Judge Garrison denied the motion, but looked thoughtful. Diana started the defense case Friday morning with Officer Dennis Wolfe. Dennis was in his 70s now, gray-haired and retired, but his memory of Wright's juvenile case was crystal clear. He described responding to a call about inappropriate touching and finding 17-year-old Wright with his 10-year-old neighbor. He testified about Wright's lack of remorse and his statement blaming the child. Margaret objected repeatedly, but Judge Garrison allowed the testimony as relevant to Wright's pattern of behavior and character for truthfulness. Diana then called the 3 former victims Wright had abused at previous churches. Each told essentially the same story. Wright had befriended them during vulnerable times, groomed them with special attention, abused them, and threatened them into silence. One was now 25 years old and had spent years in therapy dealing with the trauma. Another had attempted suicide twice as a teenager. The third had never told anyone what happened until Diana's investigator contacted him. Margaret's cross-examination tried to suggest the men were lying for attention or money, but they all testified they'd signed NDAs and received settlements that they were violating by being here. They had no financial motive and were risking legal consequences to prevent Wright from hurting more children. The jury looked increasingly upset, one woman openly crying. Dr. Patricia Thornton testified Friday afternoon about grooming patterns and trauma responses. She explained how predators like Wright target vulnerable children, build trust with families and communities, and use institutional authority to silence victims. She walked the jury through Ethan's journal, showing how the entries documented classic grooming and abuse patterns. She testified that Ethan's delayed disclosure and initial recanting when he tried to report were consistent with severe trauma and threats from the abuser. Margaret's cross tried to suggest Dr. Thornton was biased because Diana had hired her, but Patricia had testified in over 200 cases for both prosecution and defense, and her credentials were impeccable. Kevin Walsh testified Monday morning about Wright's computer files. The jury saw redacted samples of the photos and videos Wright had collected. Several jurors looked sick. Kevin explained the metadata showing the files dated back 15 years and the network of users Wright had been trading with. Margaret tried to argue the computer evidence wasn't relevant to what Ethan did, but Judge Garrison said it was directly relevant to establishing Wright's pattern of predatory behavior and Ethan's knowledge of that pattern. Diana called Ethan to testify Monday afternoon. He looked terrified walking to the witness stand, but his voice was steady when he swore to tell the truth. Diana spent 2 hours walking him through his story, starting with his mother's death and Wright's initial attention. Ethan described how Wright had offered to counsel him through grief, how the counseling sessions had become increasingly physical, how Wright had told him this was normal and helpful. He described the first assault and how he'd frozen, unable to process what was happening. He described Wright's threats about what would happen if Ethan told. The courtroom was completely silent, except for Ethan's voice. He described trying to tell the church elders and being dismissed. He described trying to tell me and my reaction. His voice broke when he talked about discovering Wright, was starting to groom Leo, about confronting Wright and being laughed at. He described buying the gasoline and going to Wright's house, standing outside trying to decide if he could really do this. He described lighting the fire and then immediately calling 911 from a payphone 2 blocks away to make sure firefighters would get there in time. I didn't want him dead, Ethan said. I just wanted him scared enough to stop. I wanted him to know someone would fight back even if adults wouldn't protect us. Margaret's cross-examination was vicious. She questioned every detail of Ethan's story, suggested he was lying about the abuse, implied he'd acted out of anger rather than fear for Leo. She asked why he hadn't reported to police instead of church elders, and Ethan said he'd thought the church would handle it since Wright was their employee. She asked why he hadn't told me more forcefully, and Ethan started crying, saying he'd tried but I hadn't wanted to hear it. Margaret asked if he understood that arson was illegal, even if his story was true, and Ethan said yes, but he'd thought protecting Leo was more important than staying out of trouble. So, you decided to take the law into your own hands? Margaret asked. I decided to do what every adult in my life should have done, Ethan answered. Protect a child. Margaret had no response to that. Diana called me as the final defense witness Wednesday morning. I testified about Ethan's personality before the abuse, how he'd changed, how I'd attributed the changes to grief rather than seeing the real cause. I testified about the conversation where Ethan had tried to tell me, and I'd shut him down. I admitted under oath that I'd failed my son, had been so focused on my own grief and my work that I'd missed the signs. Diana asked if I'd ever seen any indication Ethan was violent or dangerous. I said never, that he was the gentlest person I knew. Margaret's cross suggested I was biased because Ethan was my son. I said yes, I was biased because I loved him and knew his character. Margaret asked if I condoned vigilante violence, and I said I condoned children protecting other children when adults failed them. Closing arguments happened Wednesday afternoon. Margaret focused on the rule of law, saying no matter what Wright had done, attempted murder couldn't be excused. She said Ethan had other options and had chosen violence. She asked the jury to consider what society would look like if everyone took justice into their own hands. Diana's closing was powerful. She talked about institutional failure, about how every system that should have protected Ethan had instead protected his abuser. She talked about the church elders who'd believed him but chose reputation over safety. She talked about the police detective who'd threatened him into silence. She talked about me missing the signs because I was drowning in my own grief. She talked about Leo, who'd been spared abuse because Ethan had been willing to sacrifice his freedom to protect another child. This case isn't about condoning vigilante violence. It's about recognizing that when every legitimate authority fails a child, desperate measures become the only option. Ethan Carver is guilty of arson. He admits that. But he's not guilty of attempted murder because he specifically set that fire to avoid killing Pastor Wright. He's not a criminal. He's a traumatized child who was failed by every adult in his life and made an impossible choice to save another child from his fate. The jury got the case at 4 p.m. Wednesday, and we waited. Diana said quick verdicts usually meant convictions, but she thought we had a chance. The jury deliberated through the evening and came back Thursday morning requesting to review Ethan's journal and the computer evidence. They deliberated all Thursday and sent a note Friday morning saying they were deadlocked. Judge Garrison gave them an Allen charge, encouraging them to try harder to reach unanimous agreement. They deliberated until 5 p.m. Friday and sent another note saying they were still deadlocked. Judge Garrison called them in and asked if they thought more time would help. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who'd been taking extensive notes throughout trial, said the jury was split on attempted murder, but unanimous on arson. Judge Garrison asked if they'd like guidance on lesser-included offenses, and the foreman said yes. The judge sent them back with instructions about reckless endangerment as an alternative to attempted murder. The jury came back Saturday afternoon with a verdict: guilty of arson. Not guilty of attempted murder, guilty of reckless endangerment. Ethan's face crumpled in relief and terror simultaneously. Diana squeezed his shoulder and whispered something to him. Sentencing was set for 3 weeks out. Diana filed motions for probation instead of incarceration, citing Ethan's age, lack of prior record, and the circumstances that led to his actions. Margaret filed a sentencing memo asking for 5 years in juvenile detention, followed by transfer to adult prison to complete a longer sentence. The 3 weeks before sentencing were excruciating. Diana prepared character witnesses and gathered letters of support. Marcus documented the failure of every system that should have protected Ethan. Jessica Navarro wrote a series of articles about institutional failures in child protection that won her a state press award. The sentencing hearing was packed with supporters on both sides. Wright's wife and daughter sat in the front row, asking for maximum punishment. Abuse survivors' advocates filled the rest of the gallery wearing purple ribbons. Judge Garrison heard from probation officers, psychologists, Diana's character witnesses, and Wright's family. She read the sentencing memos and victim impact statements. Then she looked at Ethan and spoke directly to him. Mr. Carver, you were failed by every adult who should have protected you. That failure doesn't excuse what you did, but it provides context that I'm required to consider. You set a fire that could have killed someone. That person was your abuser, but that doesn't make arson legal or acceptable. However, you also took steps to minimize the risk of death, which suggests you weren't trying to murder Pastor Wright despite the trauma he inflicted. You called 911 immediately to ensure firefighters responded. These actions show judgment and restraint, even in a moment of desperation. She sentenced Ethan to time served plus 5 years probation with conditions including therapy, community service, and regular check-ins with a probation officer. She suspended a 5-year juvenile detention sentence provided Ethan complied with probation. The courtroom erupted with reactions ranging from applause to outrage. Wright's daughter screamed that justice hadn't been served. Abuse advocates cheered. Judge Garrison gavelled everyone into silence and said her decision was final. Ethan would be released that afternoon. Diana drove us home from the courthouse and I couldn't stop crying. Couldn't believe my son was actually coming home. Ethan sat in the back seat silent, processing that his nightmare was finally over. Wright pleaded guilty to federal child exploitation charges 3 months later and was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. The church elders who'd covered up his abuse were never charged criminally, but civil suits from victims bankrupted the church and forced it to close. Margaret Finley lost her re-election campaign after opponents highlighted her husband's role in enabling Wright's abuse. Diana continued taking abuse cases and used Ethan's case as precedent for defending desperate victims who'd exhausted legitimate remedies. Ethan started community college 2 years later, studying social work, wanting to help other kids navigate the systems that had failed him. He speaks at survivor conferences about institutional failure and the importance of believing children who report abuse. 5 years after the sentencing, on a warm Saturday in September, I watched Ethan graduate with his bachelor's degree in social work, and his eyes weren't dead anymore, but alive with purpose. And I finally believed we'd both survived the fire that had consumed our old lives and forged something stronger from the ashes. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.